Morning. I'd like to thank everybody for coming this morning. I guess somewhat of a kickoff, special Yom Tov Shiurim, first time back in quite a few weeks. And it's very meaningful, whoever is watching. Just yesterday, Shabbos, I saw multiple members of the shir that I haven't seen in a while, and everyone's itching to get back to normalcy, to have the shir fully live, and Be'ez Hashem, we hope that day will come Be'ez Hashem soon, but obviously we have to play the lot that we're given, so we're still doing this one live on Zoom, on live stream. I would like to welcome, I believe that my shir is watching this. We figured out a way how I could be here, they could be there, and we could do this. So I'd like to welcome them. I'd like to thank Rabbi Flamholtz, who is excited to have his son in the shir, gets virtually together with him, and he has sponsored donuts for the whole shir. Harvey, it's almost like olden days. Guys eating the donuts, smile on everyone's face. So we're getting close. Unfortunately, not everybody is here. I'd like to publicly acknowledge Mr. Merrifield, unfortunately, has a levaya today for a parent. I think Harvey sent out the information to everybody. Mr. Meroff is someone who is very involved in the shir, and unfortunately, right now he's in Onain, and he can't be at the shir, though I think as soon as he gets up from Shiva, this is going to be one of the first things he's going to do, is Be'ez Hashem watch the shir. I myself feel lucky to be here. Many complications tried to snag today's share from happening. The biggest loss, unfortunately, my wife's grandmother, Rabbi Neumann, Shalom, wonderful tzaddikus, treasure that unfortunately passed away last week. Wife had to run off to Nachum, but Baruch Hashem, we're here. I would like to talk today about Rosh Hashanah. Specifically, the aspect, we know Rosh Hashanah this year is not going to be simple, and many shuls are coming up with plan A, plan B, and plan C for davening. And davening Rosh Hashanah, really it's its own shir, it's its own parsha, what to do. It's not easy. There are people that haven't missed davening in shul for decades upon decades. You know, it's how could people feel like, how can I not be in shul for Yom Noraim? It's a time when everyone comes together, and even though it's been very hard being away from shul for many people on a daily basis, for sure Shabbosim, people experienced even Yom Tov at home, but if it comes to that a person can't come to shul in Yom Noraim, it's a very challenging situation. Perhaps throughout the share, the end of the share, we'll try to address that. But what I would like to talk about specifically is the mitzvah Tkiyah Shofar, which that itself, I believe, even people who may not be able to come to shul for davening, but to be able to hear Tkiyah Shofar, there are perhaps opportunities that they have to hear it. In this wonderful neighborhood, North Miami Beach, it was organized already a few weeks ago. There's a listing of individuals that have graciously dedicated themselves to to be blowing shofar all around the neighborhood. I looked at the list. It's so comprehensive. Almost every few blocks, every area, there's going to be an outdoor Tekiah shofar in this neighborhood to service the people who can come to shul, can make it to shul, and anyone who's involved in it, from the shofar blowers to the people arranging it, to the people publicizing it. It's a tremendous, tremendous mitzvah. Today's share, I want to talk about, in general, the Tekiah shofar, things that we might be doing different this year because of COVID, and in particular, the concept of blowing shofar outside. I would add, and I know in some cases like this, right now, people already could start making plans, reserving their seats for Yom Noraim. But we're in such a fluid situation where things could change, in a moment's notice. It's a type of thing we need backup plans. And people who are planning, Baruch Hashem, healthy, they're going to be in shul. But all it takes to ban someone from shul and public gatherings is if you came in contact with somebody who potentially, who tested positive for COVID, or even someone just has the symptoms who doesn't yet have the results of a COVID test. And depending on the guidelines of the shuls, the places you're coming, some of them have pretty strict guidelines. You can't be there, and people have to be cognizant. The shul's guidelines, places they're going to be, that there are many situations that pop up on you that you're planning on being there. All of a sudden, I can't make it. All it takes, you can have one kid who throws up. It's pretty normal for kids, but unfortunately, if that's considered a potential COVID symptom, and you might need to be tested for that, so then that's potential exposure. You may not be able to come to shul. So we have to have plan Bs. We have to know the logistics, the halachas of blowing shofar outside, what to do with it. My first year, when I was, I think about blowing shofar outside. My first year here in Miami, I remember I was walking home with my son after davening, Rosh Hashanah morning, walking down the canal, picturesque scene, and all of a sudden, as I'm walking down the canal, I hear shofar blowing. Now, this is not Flatbush, there's no Stiebel on every other block of the canal. Where am I hearing shofar blowing on the canal? I look back, and before I could turn back, speeding past me on a skateboard were a couple of kids with the skateboard on their feet, Jewish kids, shofar in their hand, blowing shofar as they go down the canal. I guess I heard of, traveling menorahs. I never heard yet of traveling shofars skateboarding down the canal. I thought it was quite strange. That's not what I pictured of shofar blowing. I don't know what they were doing. Probably just having fun. But really, the concept that we're going to be having shofar blowings around the neighborhood outside is a davar muzar. It's a strange thing. And I would like to go through in halacha. There are potential issues involved in it. Besides the fact, we probably should be a little bit conscious of where we do it, how it looks. I'm not sure we want to be on the cover of the Miami Herald. All these Jews gathering together, to blow shofar. Inside our shuls, they don't usually come in. But if we're all over the streets blowing shofar, I assume that's something that we have to be cognizant of. So I would like to go through, in general, the halachas of blowing shofar. There are things out there. People in some communities are recommending that this year they should blow shofar with a mask on top of the shofar. You never know what a shofar could spread. There are some studies, musical instruments and rehearsals have been places where COVID has spread. And even though there's a normal distance of how far a person's speaking, his germs could spread. When you're blowing through a shofar, it potentially could go much more than that. And there are some recommending, some rabbanim, that you should put a kippah on top of your shofar. You put a mask on top of the big opening of the shofar to prevent germs from going out. Guess we should talk about in halacha. Is that a simple thing to do or not? Is that a recommended thing to do or not? I heard of other ideas in some shuls. Someone just told me on Shabbos that they positioned that they have a room right off the shul, and they have the Baal Tokea blowing in that room. Is that okay? Obviously, normally you blow in the middle of the base matters, middle of the shul, and here they're blowing in a different room. How's that play out? So we'd like to go through. There are many questions about shofar blowing this year, both indoors and outdoors. Probably spend more time outdoors, but we'll also discuss shofar blowing indoors. First area that I would like to touch upon is the chiyuvim of Tekiyah Shofar. A man, a boy over bar mitzvah, has a clear mitzvah saseh that he has to hear shofar. The minimum is 30 kolos. Obviously, we do more. We do it as part of davening, ends up more. But the minimum of kolos has to be heard by a person. Obviously, if a person's bedridden and there's nobody that can blow shofar for them, they're known as they're pater. But ideally, every man over bar mitzvah has a chiyuv to hear shofar. A woman, on the other hand, it's a beferish halacha, Shulchan Aruch and Tavkov Peites, didn't have room on the sheet. But the Shulchan Aruch writes that a woman is pater from Tekiyah Shofar, Mishum Daven Mitzvah Seishes Man Grama. Being the fact that this is a time-related mitzvah, the halacha is that a woman is exempt. A woman is pater from this mitzvah. However, the Maharil writes that this mitzvah of shofar in particular, women were always very into, and they were very mizaris in it. They would come to shul to hear shofar. They would figure out what they could do with their kids, bless their kids, make noise and be mafsik someone. Rabbi Kiva Eger says in his days the language Rov Noshin Didan Machmir La'atzmon V'Zihiris V'Zrizas Akayim Mitzvah Seizman Gramas like shofar. So it seems that for generations upon generations, even though there's no chiyuv of a mitzvah of shofar by women, but this is one of the mitzvahs that women accept upon themselves. And thus, women have always tried to hear Tekiyah Shofar. This year in particular, if you think about it, it's going to be harder for women to hear shofar than normally, because in a normal year, women could go to shul. A lot of times, if children at home, they could bring them along, and there's some groups, there's some other kids to run around with inside shul, outside of shul. And this way, the women can hear Tekiyah Shofar. This year, however, many shuls have very strict policies not allowing children in shul. Really, this is something which is, it's unfortunate. There are so many things Anytime you make decisions on something, there's so many small details which are collateral damage potentially. One of the area of life which have been people have lost out a lot in this period are kids. They lose out when they don't have school, and they lose out. Part of chinuch is teaching a kid how to daven, and all the more so Yom Noraim. Obviously, a kid not expected to sit there the entire time through davening, but to realize the importance of the day, to know what a Yom Kippur is, to know what Yom Noraim are, and for a kid to not be able to come to shul is not simple. Now, I understand the reasoning. It's not simple with COVID and if kids running around, but what can we do? But an effect of that is it could be there are many women that will be much harder this year than any other year for them to come to shul and hear Tekiyah Shofar. So they very much might be relying upon these outdoor Tekiyah Shofars where they'll be blowing outdoors and maybe they can bring their kids along. And this way they'll hear Tekiyah Shofar, a block away from their house. Now, as we're talking about both the men and the women's chiyuv of shofar, I'd like to point out there's a few halach nafkaminas I came across in the difference between a man's responsibility to hear shofar and a woman's. Multiple nafkaminas. We know there's a halacha. In fact, once spoke about this at length when we gave a share on Rav Henkin, that there's really an isser for a person to eat before Tekiyah Shofar. And the whole concept that many shuls have a kiddush because of a long davening, which that too this year might be different. But the whole concept of having a kiddush and eating before Tekiyah Shofar is not pashut. And Rav Henkin was very strong that one is not allowed to eat before Tekiyah Shofar. Now that halacha clearly applies to a man. A man who has a chiyuv of hearing shofar, he's not allowed to eat in normal circumstances, pashtos, before Tekiyah Shofar. The heter that many used to make kiddush beforehand, and since it's such a long davening and people need strength to get through it, so thus that supersedes it. But not a simple halacha. So the Chai Adam writes, women though would be allowed to eat before Tekiyah Shofar. And the difference is between men and women, it's like we started. Men have a chiyuv of a mitzvah shofar. Women, it's a minhag. Now, if they accepted that minhag as a chiyuv for themselves, then this would come with it. The same way that they accept upon themselves the mitzvah, they accept upon themselves the halachas associated with the mitzvah. And thus a woman would not be able to eat before Tekiyah Shofar, just like a man. However, the Chai Adam understands that a woman's chumrah of Tekiyah Shofar was not taken as a chiyuv. And in this situation, not to eat before Tekiyah Shofar, women are allowed to. That's what the Chai Adam writes. He brings another nafkamina on the Chai Adam. We know normally if a person has a minute to do something, once you do it 3 times, so it already becomes like second nature. It becomes something really accepted on a person. And a person might need, if they want to stop that minhag, hataras nedarim. They have to undo that vow, even if they never spoke it out. But once you do something, there's a regilas to it. So then it becomes like a neder, and you need a hatara on it. You need to undo it. However, the Chai Adam says the same idea. You have a woman who for years and years, Baruch Hashem, was able to hear Tekiyah Shofar. So 1 year she's sick. And she's bedridden, she can't go to shul, she can't hear shofar in any way. Does she need hatara? The answer is no. Because the Chai Adam says a woman was only mekabel, they only accepted upon themselves in a situation where they're able to do it. But they never meant to accept it in a case of where they're sick. By a man, the Torah is mechayiv in all cases. Okay, you're pater, and that's rachman patre. But it's a neder, it's an acceptance of something. The Chayadim says they didn't accept it as a full chiyuv. They only accepted it where they're able to do it, which is also, I think, something very important. Obviously, a person should ask a shayla on their own circumstances. But a woman this year, if, where she is, in her town, in her city, there aren't really extra blowings that she's able to go to, and she's not able to hear Tkiyah Shofar because of circumstance. So there might be room in such a situation. Okay, fulfilled. She can't do anything about it. And the women accept upon themselves. Chayalim seems to say they accept upon themselves within reason where they're able to do it. Where they're sick, they're not makabel that on themselves. Perhaps this type of year, this type of circumstances might also be nichla on that. And unfortunately, if they're not at all able to do it, what can you do? One other halacha, this to me would sound like an interesting chiddush. I found that Shmuel Kamenetsky says. Let's say a woman goes to hear Tkiyah Shofar. As we said, obviously it's always challenging what to do with the kids. And she brings the kids with. And next thing she knows, she missed out some of the Tkiyahs because her kids were pulling on her, Mommy, I need something. So Shmuel says, different than by a man. By a man, if something happened and you missed some of the tkiyas, some of the ikar tkiyas that you need to be yotzi the mitzvah, you got to do it again. But Shmuel has a pretty big chiddush that if a woman did not hear the tkiyas well, he wants to be medayik, the lashon of poskim, then a woman does not have to go and hear it again. Very important halacha. I'm sure this comes up every year. Again, if a woman tried to hear the kolos, but she missed something, Rav Shmuel says that you don't have to go back and hear additional kolos. Quite a chiddush. Now, I decided to speak about women, obviously because this is nogea them, as we portrayed a lot, but there's a very, very interesting halacha which I'm not sure many people are aware of. Shulchan Aruch, Hilchos Yontif, right? There's a simple understanding, which is clearly in halacha not true, that on Yontif, let's talk about a city which does not have an Erev, right? A city which has an Erev, obviously is different. Well, let's talk. I grew up in Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn, or Moshe said, there's no Erev. So what does one do? We know on Shabbos they can't carry, but on Yom Tov one could carry. But it's not a carte blanche heter to carry. The heter to carry on Yom Tov is for Ochel Nefesh, for food-like things. There's a heter on Yom Tov to do things for Ochel Nefesh. And there's an extension to that din, that's the din of mitoch, that once we allow mitoch, because of the fact we allow one to carry for Ochel Nefesh, we also permit other circumstances. They talk about cases where if you don't carry something, there might be a loss, pseida. Okay? So there's a heter to carry things which are not Ochel Nefesh. But it doesn't mean you carry absolutely everything. Not true. In fact, the Magen Avraham and the Taz really argue on the whole extension, how far you could take it. And the Mishabura, this is Siman Tav Kuf Yud Ches. Remember, I think it was Daled. The Mishabura over there brings down this Taz and Magen Avraham that argue on this extension of carrying, and says that it's Nachal Mahachmer. Ideally, one should be Machmer and careful not to carry things which are not needed for food-like or clear Yom Tov perhaps needs. On top of that, and this I did get to put on the sheets, there's a Shari Tshuva. The Shari Tshuva is in Orach Chaim, Siman Tov Kuf Pei Tes. Shari Tshuva writes the following. He's quoting a Shagas Aryeh. Kas b'Shagas Aryeh, Siman Kuf Dalid. Sheyosu roy le'ish utkei le'isha mishtaki hi la'atzmo. Okay. In general, men should be blowing shofar for women. As opposed to a woman blowing for a woman blowing for herself. Shaila is what the mitzvah is. Tekiyah shofar, shmiya shofar. Okay. Then he writes further, V'ayin sham simin kovav. He quotes another Shagas Aryeh. She'aser lahotzi lulav o shofar l'reshus harabim. It would be prohibited to carry a shofar or a lulav in Reshus Harabim l'tzorech isha shetita lulav o tishman tekiyah shofar. In contrast, he writes, and he says in Siman Kuf Zayin, the Shagas Aryeh allowed to take a shofar out for a man who's mesupik if he heard the tekiyos or not, but not for a woman. What the Shari Tshuva over here is bringing, very interesting halacha. The whole heter to carry even a shofar on Yom Tov, you need to come on to a din of mitoch. That mitoch, they matter for ochel nefesh, they could matter perhaps for other Yom Tov needs. However, the Shagas Aryeh understands that only applies to a man's chiyuv, even to a man's suffik chiyuv. Because we said a man has an absolute chiyuv of tekiyah shofar, it's a mitzvah say. But a woman, on the other hand, a woman doesn't have a chiyuv of tekiyah shofar, it's a mitzvah say shman grama. A woman does not have a chiyuv of taking lulav. If you would carry home from shul your lulav for your wife, or carry a shofar into the street for a woman, that'll be also. According to the Shari Tshuva, one would not be allowed to take a shofar into the street to blow for a woman. Whether that means you're taking the shofar in the street to go to your house where you're going to blow for the woman over there, or whether our case is this year, there'll be a lot of blowings outside. According to the simple understanding of this Shari Tshuva, you would not be allowed to have a shofar blowing for women outside. Wow. Now, one great chap, and yes, I see some people in the audience already thought of this. Okay, if you're allowed to do it for a man, you just can't do it for a woman. So why don't we stage that every shofar blowing outside has at least one man there? You don't even need a man that didn't hear it yet. You just need one of these guys that are mesupik. Did I hear it? Did I not hear it? Just take one of those guys. As long as there's a man there, then you could take it outside. And once you take it outside, once you blow the shofar, then you could blow it for the women too. Now, you might get me though. Hey, it's not my suggestion, it was yours. You might say there might be a little bit of harama, there might be a little bit of a trick. You're really doing it for the women, you just prop this guy over here. You know, it sounds like a Biden press conference. But, okay, yeah, props are not so simple. We can't do those things. So, yeah, it's not pashut. But according to the Shari Tshuva, one would not be allowed to take a shofar into the Reshus Harabim, carry a shofar out on Yom Tov to blow, because women don't have a chiyuv. It's only a minhag, it's only something that they are machmar themselves, but that's not a chiyuv. And the Shari Tshuva says, thus one can't do it. However, don't end the share here. There is multiple sources that vehemently argue with the Shari Tshuva. The Be'er Halacha in Siman Tov Kuf Yud Ches, I put a quote of it on the sheet, middle of the sheet. He quotes from Tosfos that we would do it even, we would be mater mitoch even for a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and that itself would be sufficient for women. The Shulchan Aruch Harav writes that a woman would feel bad if she's not part of the mitzvah of Tekiyah Shofar. For nachas ruach, for itil lahem isar kal kazeh shemil mishum shvos gamor and mishum l'chol. Yeah, he writes even further. Mutar l'chotzia shofar shusarabim nil kel behem. The Shulchan Aruch Harav says clearly, arguing the Shari Tshuva, you could take it out to blow for them. The Rav Moshe, the Igros Moshe, Arachayim, Chel Gimel, Siman Tzadi Dalid, attacks the Shagas Aryeh and says he has a rush that clearly supports that it's mutter in this case. So it brings a Marsham. I saw someone else ask a question that it's mashma from the Ramah by Hilchas Sukkah, Dalminim. The Ramah writes a lashon: "Madakim yochaz alu biyada kishnechim mibeis lebeis hakneses, v'chein yachzur lebeisa kadei lechaviv mitzvah." That one is allowed to be holding on to your lulav in the street al tzchiv of mitzvah because of an excitement, a belovedness for mitzvahs. Right? There's a concept of chiv of mitzvah. We find that that's the idea of kissing dvarim of a mitzvah. So here by a lulav, one of the ways you show your chavivas for it, your love for it, is by parading down the street holding your lulav and esrog. Who doesn't like doing that? And the Ramah says one will be allowed to carry that because of chiv of a mitzvah. So someone wanted to argue on the Shari Tshuva that a woman's desire to hear a Tekiyah Shofar shouldn't be, any less than this concept of chiv of mitzvah. One could potentially attack that point, defend the Shari Tshuva, that maybe there's only a din of chiv of mitzvah once you have a chiv. But a woman who doesn't have a chiv, it's not to see, can't start off with a din of chiv of mitzvah, especially to allow one to carry in the Shusarabim. Okay. But either way, the majority of poskim, from the Mishabura, Shulchan Aruch Harav, Igros Moshe, all give license to take out the shofar into the Rishus Harabim to blow for women. So I just made a scare. Really, it is allowed 100% according to most of these poskim. They don't adapt the position of the Shari Tshuva according to that Shagas Aryeh, that it would be aser. Most of the poskim do say that it would be mutter, and thus, by all means, there is license, at least halachically, to have shofar blowings in the public domain this year. I would add one other halacha. People sometimes think, they're used to hearing shofar in shul. Let's say a man, missed shofar blowing, so he feels like, oh, I missed it in the shul. It's just going to blow for me. Maybe I'll get a minyan together. A shofar blowing, you could be the only man there. It still works. You don't need a minyan. In fact, pashtas, minyan doesn't even add anything to it. If there's chazar shots, and okay, then the shofar that was misakin, parts of davening, or something else, it's a minyan. But just for the tekiyos alone, one does not need a minyan. It can be done outside. And one other area that I'd like to touch on, a very important halacha, is the halacha of kol havara. Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tav Kuf Pei Zayin brings down the halacha, it's Gemara, that someone who blows in a pit or a cave, it seems the Mitzias was, many times in Jewish history, we were hiding from the Goyim, and the places where they would have to hide to blow shofar were in caves, were in pits. So the people inside the pit, that's okay. They heard the shofar, they're yotzei. But the people outside, the Shulchan Aruch writes, if they hear a kol shofar, they're yotzei. If they did not hear the kol shofar, rather they heard, I'll just use the words kol havara, they're not yotzei. What does the words kol havara mean? So the simple pshat is it's an echo, which would make sense for those cases, right? You're blowing in a cave, you're blowing in a pit. Potentially there's an echo. So the people inside the pit are hearing you blow it, but maybe the people outside the pit, it's questionable about what they're hearing. So that's where the halacha depends. If it's a they know they're hearing shofar, that's good enough. If it's this kol havara, which will now translate as an echo, then they will not be yotzei. It's interesting that it's clear from the halacha that who's supposed to determine what you're hearing. It's shaykh for a person to pick this up himself. I'm not sure exactly how. I'm not sure everyone has an ear for it, but the halacha says, look, a person could determine. Maybe we have to have experts at each shul that speech therapists, they have good ear for things. I don't know, but people could discern: are they hearing a shofar, the kol of the shofar itself, or is it an echo? Now, there's a very important taz over here. This is quoted in the Bir Halach on the bottom of your sheets. The taz brings us halach of kol havara, and he extends it to the following case. He talks about a case. V'tokeh b'beis knesses v'yish omdim b'chutz ksas rachot b'beis knesses. Yish gam kein b'zeh sheiches havchana v'yirichem b'beis knesses, has this issue of kol havara. Someone's standing outside the shul, someone's blowing inside the shul, and they're hearing it outside the shul. So that would also be a situation of kol havara. Now this probably also happens because sometimes I have a woman, she's rushing to shul to hear tekiyos. She gets there drop late, but she hears it as she's coming to the shul plaza. When she's there, she already hears it. So you could easily have that situation. But we'll get to other cases which will be a result of this. L'chara, what's the Taz extending this? Why is the Taz, the case we were talking about till now, was in a pit, in a cave. Here they're blowing inside the shul, and you're hearing it outside the shul. What does that have to do with an echo? Because I'm hearing it outside the shul, I'm hearing an echo? And the Chavetz Chaim seems to understand in the Bir Halacha that the Taz's definition of kol havara does not mean echo. What kol havara really is a weaker, distorted kol. When you're inside the shul, you hear a clear, straight kol. When you're outside the shul, it's going to be somewhat distorted, somewhat weaker. You could have this issue. That could have been, the Taz seems to understand that was the problem in the caves versus outside the caves, in the pits outside the pit. That there is a distortion in the sound of the shofar. And a distortion, if you're hearing the kol shofar, then you're yotzei. If you're hearing a distortion, you're not yotzei. And what's tricky is the Chavetz Chaim brings in the Bir Halacha this Taz, and he ends off that ideally, read you the Lashon, Kol Makom L'Maisa, Ein Lazuz Midivrei HaTaz, the last line in the sheets that I gave out, Shekol Achronim Etiko Devar V'Halacha. And therefore, someone hearing shul a shofar from outside of shul has to be careful that what he's hearing is a shofar sound and not some distortion. Now, l'chora, this halacha could have major, major ramifications. Again, it seems to be a machlokas, the pashtos in the Shulchan Aruch versus the Taz. Pashtos of Shulchan Aruch, which is definitely understood by many poskim, versus the Taz's understanding. Many poskim understand there's only a limitation on the sound of a shofar if it's an echo sound. If you hear an echo, then that wouldn't work. But a distorted sound, there's no makar for that. But the Taz, on the other hand, says no. Kol havara does not mean an echo. Kol havara means a distortion. It means a weaker kol. And that potentially is a problem. Now, I want to be very careful before I go through the nafkaminas, because this could create havoc. And every Rav has to paskin for their kihila, and these things aren't simple. Let's talk just in general, terms. Before I get to this year's COVID, I knew the Bachar in Yeshiva who also had, had a hearing aid, and he asked a shaila, and the poskim told him that he should not hear the shofar through the hearing aid, because that in itself might be a distortion. I believe that was the reason. And thus, he would come all the way up. He would take out the hearing aid, how to do that on Yom Tov. He would take it out, off, and he would come up. I was up there as a gabbai in yeshiva for many years, right there with the Baal Tokea, and this individual would stand right there because that's what he was told to do by a posek. And going through the sugya now, I believe it was because of this idea. Because if you hear it through his hearing aid, there might be some distortion there. Okay? Obviously, we'll talk about in a moment. Other poskim say different. Covering the shofar. As somebody who's given shirim with a mask on my face, do I feel my voice is distorted by a mask? 100%. Some masks do a better job of distorting than others. Some are worse for that. Maybe they filter better too. But for sure, one's voice is distorted by a mask. So imagine putting a mask on top of a shofar. Okay, it could be the different types of masks. I find that those disposable ones distort less. But who knows what they're fixing onto shofar? It may not be so simple according to this here halacha. If it's distorting the sound, that might be a problem. Not sure. Let's say a person blows. Some shul had an idea. We'll have the shofar blower stand in a different room and blow into the heichal of the shul. He's not in the shul. He's in a different place. He's blowing. That might be some type of distortion. I just spoke to an expert shofar blower the other day. He was telling me he normally blows, in the center. Okay, but he happened to be in COVID. He was davening in a certain corner under a short roof in the basement, in the base medrash, and he felt that the sound of the shofar was different than it normally was. The spot or where a shofar is blown makes a big difference, especially if it's in a different room. What exactly are they hearing? So all this is tricky. Is a tricky area. I did find there Shmuel Kamenetsky. He's got broad shoulders. He rules that the pashtos in the poskim is not the way the Chavetz Chaim gripped it in the Be'er Halacha, and it's not to expand the Taz to all these other cases. Rather, it's only by an echo, and Shmuel himself feels quite comfortable to be Meko, which would, I believe, have many nafkaminas in all these things, whether it's a hearing aid, whether it's a cover to the shofar, whether it's blowing in another room, as long as there's no echo sound. Now, it could be, people would say a hearing aid, maybe that also is an echo, I don't know. But Rav Shmuel is willing to say, as long as it's not an echo, even if it's somewhat distorted, somewhat weaker, so then it will still be okay. However, one who's going with the psak of the Chavetz Chaim and the Be'er Halacha, it seems quite clear that the Chavetz Chaim says any type of distortion would be a problem, and it's right to follow the psak of this Taz. So thus, we've tackled quite a few topics this morning, whether it's in general, the concept of a man's chiyuv, a woman's chiyuv, taking the shofar outside to blow, blowing outside, blowing with a cover, different room, distortions, echoes. These are all issues in general to Tekiah Shofar, but all the more so this year when we're tinkering with things and we're changing up how to do Tekiah Shofar. These are all halachas and concepts to be cognizant of in this discussion. I'd like to end with a beautiful thought I heard years ago, B'Shem Rav Aaron Kotler. And it's quite appropriate this year for two reasons. This year, the first day of Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos. The halacha is we do not blow shofar on Shabbos. Not because you can't blow shofar on Shabbos, but rather it's one of these very interesting halachas, the koach of the Chachamim. The Chazal were afraid that a person would carry that shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and thus they asered the blowing of shofar on the first day of Yom Tov. Similar, we have other areas. Chazal made similar gzeros, and people are troubled by that. There's a very, very big inyan in Tekiah Shofar. Tekiah Shofar isn't just, okay, we're fulfilling a mitzvah of blowing shofar. Of course, that's true. But the underlying meaning behind Tekiah Shofar, it's the time of din, and we hope through our blowing of shofar, we turn HaKadosh Baruch Hu's din into rachamim, and Hashem should have rachmanos on us, have mercy on us. And the shofar is an instrument to change what's going on in the heavens. We really want our tkiyos to go all the way up there with no distortion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kisei hakavod and to affect our din. So if shofar is such a powerful vehicle for the Jewish people, what are we going to do on the year when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos? Chazal went and made an Isser not to carry, but what's going to be with Tekiah Shofar? How are we going to change the din to Rachamim? Dr. Rav Aaron Kotler, beautifully so. The same way that Tekiah Shofar has the power, is a schus to change HaKadosh Baruch Hu's din to Rachamim. If our Chazal understood that power of shofar, nevertheless they felt al pi halacha we have to aser blowing shofar on Shabbos, then they also understood that keeping this halacha, keeping the divrei chachamim, could produce the same result, the same schus to changing the din to rachamim. An amazing idea. Rav Aaron Kotler is equating the power that a Jew has when he complies with what the Rabbanim say. That mitzvah l'shmo divrei chachamim, is so powerful, just like the most beautiful tekiyos which reach the highest of the heavens. And I think that lesson is important this year, not just because Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, but for all the people that unfortunately will not be able to come to Shul. They will not be able to be there for davening. may not be able to hear Tekiyah Shofar, they should realize this yesod, that just like Tekiyah Shofar has the power to bring us schusim, equivalent to that, a person who listens to the words of the Chachamim, that itself is a tremendous schus. And the Chachamim say, Yisrael Salanter would get up there, make Kiddush and Yom Kippur at the time of a plague. The Chachamim say, listen to the doctors, you should be at home. It's too dangerous for one's health to go out in public, in the crowd. You can't do that. Then that too has the most powerful schutz, just like Shofar, to Be'ez Hashem, change HaKadosh Baruch Hu's din to Rachamim, and hopefully bring us all a ksiva v'chasima tova. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And Be'ez Hashem, see you next year.